Today, we have the privilege of sitting down with Dr. Amy Shah. Dr. Shah is a double board-certified medical doctor educated at 3 prestigious Ivy League institutions. She graduated from Cornell University and then continued her training at Einstein, Harvard, and Columbia to earn her MD. Recognized as one of Phoenix's top doctors for several years, Dr. Shah has seen her influence skyrocket with 1.4 million followers on Instagram. She's also a best-selling author with 2 popular books published in the last 5 years. Dr. Shah is an expert in fasting, gut health, food cravings, and GLP-1 receptors like Ozempic. So in today's episode, we start by introducing you to the mind-blowing science behind fasting, as we discover together what happens in the body when we fast. Fasting has many benefits, but it could also be very challenging for many of us, particularly because of our relationship to food. Many of us wrestle with intense food cravings every day, and this could leave us trapped in a cycle of shame. As you'll learn, this is actually by design. Dr. Shah pulls back the curtain for us and explains how large food companies have carefully crafted products in a lab to make us addicted. Building on previous episodes with Dr. Casey Means and Dr. Robert Lustig, we discuss why this is so problematic and how ultra-processed food is harmful for our health. We'll then explore practical ways to overcome these challenges and develop a healthier approach to food. This includes addressing all the hype around Ozempic, as Dr. Shah reveals whether it truly lives up to its reputation as a miracle drug. So without further ado, Dr. Amy Shah. So I first became aware of the data behind fasting a few years ago, and I kind of thought the mechanism was kind of mind blowing about what actually is happening in the body when you do fast. Whether that's in your latest book you talked about circadian fasting or intermittent fasting, and then there's water fasting. And so, yeah, what is your take on fasting, and what can you share with the audience what actually happens in the body when we fast?
I think every single religion and culture in the world does some form of fasting. Fasting and religion have a tight bond, because I think people realize that when you fast, you get some clarity of the mind. Right? And you can concentrate on prayer or whatever it is you're fasting for. But in almost every religion, it's fasting so that you can concentrate on religion. So they've known it for thousands of years that there is a benefit for fasting. And really, now that we know the mechanisms, it makes a lot of sense. So your body loves glucose as its first form of fuel. And when it runs out of glucose, when you fast, that's naturally what happens. You have to switch gears and start using fat for fuel. And when you make that switch, your body feels different and your brain feels different. And many people feel a sense of clarity that they don't feel when they're not fasted. And that has been really the basis of fasting for thousands of years, is that clarity that you get because of the fuel switching, the fuel switching that happens in your body. Now, the sad thing is most Americans and most people in modern countries never fuel switch, right? Because not everyone is fasting and not everyone is doing exercise to the extremes where their body does need to use that fuel switch.
And then the food cravings,
right.
Just nonstop eating, yeah.
Exactly. We're not even ever hungry in the modern world. We're almost overfull all the time, right? So fasting can be a really great exercise for the modern person to really feel what it feels like to fuel switch. And that is really the magic of fasting, is switching those fuel sources. And when you do, all these downstream changes start to happen. And so there was a paper, an opinion paper really, in Nature that talked about the mechanisms of fasting, how it could be beneficial. The problem with fasting, and as you've seen in the last few years, is that the studies are not panning out. The studies on obesity, the studies on weight loss are not panning out, and especially for intermittent fasting. And I think what we have to realize is that we live in a very complex food world. And so even if you're fasting for 16 hours a day, in the 8 hours that you're eating, you can easily eat a full day's worth of calories. And I think if you know the American food system, you know that that's definitely possible, right? Like, you could fast all you want, and then if you have a small window of eating, you probably can eat back all the calories that you missed. So the studies have not panned out in the way that they had hoped. So I go back to circadian fasting because I know for sure in my mind, both from my experience, my clinical experience, and the research, that that is a no-brainer. Everything else still has some controversy, confusion around it, which we will probably end up having more of a definitive answer in a couple of years. But circadian rhythm fasting, that's so easy to do, but nobody does it, right? Back a couple of 100 years ago, even like for me, I mentioned to you off here, but you know, my family came to America when I was 5 years old. So they talked to me that like even their childhood, there was no Uber Eats, microwaves. People just got refrigerators in most countries, right? So you didn't eat huge meals after dark. And it was not customary to have like the biggest meal of your day late in the evening. But if you look at it now, I mean, not so, it's only been like 100 years, right? We are often eating our biggest meal, large meal late at night, sometimes past 10 p.m., sometimes midnight for some people.
Why does the body need like a break from food intake?
So just like your brain, we know really easily, it's very established that your brain switches kind of to sleep mode. And if you wake up in the middle of the night, you will wake up the next morning kind of hungover, not feeling rested, right? We all had this understanding that if you wake up in the middle of the night or there's a storm or there's a emergency, you're going to wake up the next day feeling really groggy and hungover, right? It's the same thing with our GI tract. If our GI tract is in sleep mode and you wake it up to do a full digestion, like not just like a banana, but like a full meal, like you often, you know, see people doing Uber Eats or going out to dinner. That load for the gut and your hormones, your pancreas, it's like akin to waking up in the middle of the night and asking them to do a complex problem solving and then expecting the next day for it to function optimally. It doesn't, right? And we do that day in and day out. And, you know, we know shift workers, for example, are not only are they damaging their digestion, but they're more likely to have diabetes. They're more likely to die like 15 to 20 years sooner. Heart disease, diabetes, all these metabolic diseases, because our body works on the day and night cycle. And you can do all you want to try to switch it through caffeine, through sleeping at with dark curtains, but our body knows when it's day and night. And when you try to flip that, you get all kinds of diseases. So from that data, from the shift worker data, we know that it's not good for you to be awake and eating in the middle of the night. So I even tell shift workers, like, as much as possible, don't eat big meals. Like, I don't know if you've never gone to a hospital or don't know a nurse or doctor, you have to know that like part of the culture of night nurses and night doctors is like big fun meals and snacks and things in the back room.
Like kind of also fast food too, maybe? Yeah,
fast foods, popcorn, you know, donuts, just kind of to keep, it's kind of the culture of night nursing. And
it's so ironic of being medical.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's another story. But as medical residents, I remember when I was in residency, really loving the night float, the night shift job, because the nurses were always really all friends with each other and they would all bring in fun food to eat, but it's literally you're eating at the opposite hours that you're supposed to be eating. So that's why circadian rhythm, circadian fasting became something that I got really interested in, because I was like, that intuitively makes sense to me. Like, I feel better if I don't eat 2 to 3 hours before bed, and my digestion works better. And we know from the data, from even GI data, that people that eat late at night tend to have more digestive issues, right? So from all of that data, it just makes sense to me that eating early dinner and then fasting overnight and then not eating as soon as you roll out of bed, but maybe giving it a little break before you eat. That kind of fasting to me felt very intuitive and evolutionary sound, and scientifically sound. And so that's what I do. Every once in a while, I'll throw in a 24-hour fast, once a quarter, once every 6 months if I feel like it. So there's good data on 24-hour fasting. So like say like a Saturday dinner to a Sunday dinner, not that hard, right? The Latter-day Saints group does a Sunday fast, and there's really good data that their heart disease rates are
like the Sabbath or something. Like
that. And they're like their heart disease rates are astronomically low. Even when you control for all the other good things they do, like they don't drink and smoke, you control for all of that, and you still see a benefit from having that fast. So there's been some interest in that 24-hour fast. And I think for most people, that's doable. Like once in a while, if you're like, just going to eat dinner on Sunday and not going to eat anything before that, it's doable.
Well, I think it's interesting because like for most of human history, we lived in a time of like scarcity. So like we were constantly trying to get food, and now we have so much food in our society, and we're overeating at such a rapid rate. And so I've just learned that like, I mean, there's something to be said about like muscle, but like eating less rather than their culture of just like eating copious amounts of food, like the body like doesn't do well on that.
Oh, 100%. And people from certain parts of the world, like it's really interesting because people from India, for example, that's where my ancestors are from. They tend to do better being very lean because they survive through famines and droughts. And so the people who survive through famines and droughts, they don't do well with excess food and drink because they were already picked to be people that can withstand famine and drought. And, you'll see Asians and Indians getting diabetes and heart disease at insane rates, I mean, compared to their BMI, because just like you're saying, like, we're not really built to be overeating like this. This is not only not good for our weight, but really causing diabetes, heart disease, cancer, all those things.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's circadian fasting. I don't know if you're familiar with like Walter Longo's work in California, but
fasting mimicking diet.
Yeah. Fast mimicking diet. And so what he's been studying for many years now is like water fasting, and then he came up with that diet. But it seems like, like you said, traditionally it's been a spiritual exercise. I'm going to fast for a week. I'm not going to eat anything and like just do water or a couple of weeks. But it seems like, is there a benefit? It seems like there's something that happens in the body. I'm going to mess up this word, but autophagy.
Autophagy,
Yeah, that happens in the body that happens over, I don't know, 3, 5 days, 7 days.
Yeah.
That's very interesting to me. Obviously, given what you wrote, your latest book about food cravings, which we'll get into, it's very difficult for people to like not eat for that long period of time.
Yeah.
But what is your take like on longer stuff like that? So
that's why fasting mimicking diet is so much more popular than water fasting, because water fasting for 5 days is torture, and most people can't work or do their daily activities while water fasting. Although, like I said, almost in every religion and culture around the world, there's some element of water fasting. But I think most people who are doing water fasting, at least the ones that I've known in my life, they usually take time off from whatever they're doing to concentrate on that. Great. Autophagy is always happening in our cells. It's not that we need to start autophagy. Autophagy is just upregulated when we are in a fasting mode.
And what is autophagy?
So it's like the clean out of your cells. It's the garbage clean out. So imagine, this is how I always explain it. If people are always coming over to your house and they're ringing the bell and you're just kind of tidying up in between, your friends are coming and going. Like when I lived in New York City, it was like a revolving door. We always had somebody coming over. There's always friends or guests or people, neighbors coming over. So you never really get to deep clean. And that's how we are in the modern world. We're always eating at all hours of the day and night. Autophagy really starts to ramp up when you know that there's no more guests coming through the door. And so literally it's the feeling of, okay, everyone's gone. It's now time to do the deep cleaning. And that's when you take, roll up the carpets, clean out, get all the garbage out. And that's how I describe autophagy. It's like the major clean out.
So it intensifies.
It intensifies. It's like that deep cleaning mode that never really happens when you constantly have guests at the door. And so when your body senses that there's no more food coming, and that's why we don't know exactly when it upregulates. There's no sign test, and that's what makes it difficult. There's no test that we know of that we can tell when the switch flips. But when that body registers like there's no more guests coming over and they go into deep cleaning mode, that is what is upregulating autophagy. Autophagy is that deep cellular clean out. And how awesome is it that you could get a deep cellular clean out? Because, very, very rarely do we get a chance to do that. And that's why fasting has been linked to improve rates of cancer, improved rates of aging, because if you look at a cell under a microscope.
You're talking about water fasting now.
Yeah, water fasting. So the reason why long-term water fasting, going into autophagy, let's put it that way. The reason why going into autophagy has so much potential or promise is because when you do that deep clean out, the cell actually looks younger and healthier than it did before. So, normal people like us are like, whoa, I want my cells to look younger and healthier. But all of that is really difficult because, one, we don't know when autophagy starts. It's being upregulated, at least. There's no test for that. So some people say it's between 24 and 72 hours. So if you're doing a 3-day fast, you might just be getting into it. Some people say it happens at 24 hours, depending on your carbohydrate load that's left in your liver. So it's a very large window of like, we're not sure. And then the other side of it is the inconvenience. Like most of us cannot water fast for 3 to 5 days. And that's why Dr. Longo's fasting mimicking diet has been so popular. Have you ever done it?
Yeah, I've tried it. So what happens for me is like, I think I did around like the 24-hour mark, I feel like very sick.
Yeah.
And so like even when I was doing little amounts of food, I would feel very sick. But from everything I could get from researching this stuff, it seems like that isn't necessarily a negative. Like it might be happening in your body, but it's not necessarily a negative thing. Like it's the clean out thing is happening. Yeah. And that's why like when I've talked to people who are at like the 5 or 7 day mark, they're like, oh, I feel like I'm on a high, or like
yes. You know. I did the Longo fasting mimicking diet. And I would say that was what happened. About, I think, really day 2 and 3 were terrible, and I really didn't want to do it. And I was doing it just based on the fact that I was leading a group. Mm-hmm. And it just made me like think, well, I have to do it if I'm leading a group. But once you get past the day 3, like day 4 and 5 were amazing. And I see now that that would probably be true with water fasting as well. So I get what you're saying. And it's kind of like, and that's why fasting has become so difficult for the normal modern person, because we can't even do circadian fasting. Like,
yeah, we can't even not eat for like 3 hours.
Right.
Yeah.
Like, how are we going to go into water fasting 3 to 5 days? And then the data, like I said, has been mixed. There's been on the intermittent fasting. The intermittent fasting, the 16-8, has not panned out for weight loss. And so a lot of people have said, well, intermittent fasting doesn't work. But it does work. It's like saying exercise doesn't work. Like, yeah, it depends on what exercise you pick. 16-8 doesn't work for weight loss, but that doesn't mean it doesn't work for like a circadian style, doesn't work for metabolism, or a 3 to 5 day doesn't work for, whatever endpoints they're looking at. So fasting is still a big world that I think has yet to have more data around it for us to understand what the optimal time may be to do it. But I can tell you that circadian style fasting is going to be metabolically beneficial. There's plenty of studies to show that time-restricted eating, that's another way to say it, time-restricted eating is a really great way to improve metabolism. And then that 24-hour kind of Latter-day Saint fast is also really
Casey Means was talking about that.
Yeah.
About the time-restricted eating
Yeah.
and stuff like that.
Time-restricted eating is just another way of talking about intermittent fasting.
Yeah.
It's just saying that you're restricting the hours that you eat in and then you fast for the rest. So the circadian style fasting that I talk about is really a time restricted eating pattern.
What is the longest that the human body can go with fasting before like starvation?
Months, more than a month.
More than a month?
Water fasting. So Jain, my family is Jain. My parents and grew up in it's kind of like a religion similar to Buddhism, and there's long fasts involved. And there is one, people will do an 8-day fast for sure for the holy week.
Water fast?
Water fast. But many people extend it to 1 month, and many people extend it past that. So it's possible to water fast for many, many weeks.
It's like the Jesus fast.
Yeah.
40 days.
yeah, you can. You can go way longer than we think. But like you said, in today's world, it would be weird to even go 1 day, right?
Yeah, I was reading the Guinness Book of World Records on this, and this blew my mind. I have no idea. There's a guy in the 1960s who set the record for fasting. He didn't eat for 382 days.
Wow.
I don't even know how that's possible. But he was very large beforehand.
Okay.
So I guess
he
that
had
means
some
like
stores.
he had so much stores.
Yeah.
And so I guess that meant that the body was literally like could eat itself for like an entire year because he had so much stores. And I mean, he lost a massive amount of weight, but he started at like 400 pounds or something like that. But that was just really put it in perspective of like, depending on how big you are, I guess, like how long you could go without food.
The body can go a long time without food.
Yeah.
But we're in the opposite situation, right? Like, I don't think when I went to Japan, I noticed something really different about the Japanese culture. They don't allow you to take away from like fast restaurants or little cafes. There's no garbage anywhere, and there's no like takeaway containers. So you're like served in a plate or like a cup, and you're supposed to eat it right there or eat it on the bench or sit on a table. And you're not walking and eating, or like nobody on the train had like drinks or snacks with them. And it just blew my mind because I was like, wow, that is such a difference from our culture. I mean, I'm totally like I did that when I lived in New York. I always had a snack in my bag in case like things ran late, you know, you have something with you all the time, or you'd be carrying a drink with you often. And it was just so fascinating to me that, wow, the culture really is just eat where you are at, sit down and be done. It's like crazy. That would never work here.
So, I mean, just the whole idea of eating less, or even when we're talking about fasting, I mean, just all the stuff around chronic disease, like it obviously has a lot of benefits that it could potentially offer, but like you're saying, it does feel very unrealistic to people. I mean, you wrote a whole book on it, just the idea of just self-control.
Yes.
In itself. And I think even setting fasting aside for a second, like, and just talking about like having a healthy relationship with food seems like so mystifying to people.
I mean, when do you like to be called Matt or Matthew, by the way? I should ask you.
Call me Matthew. Yeah.
Matthew. I think Matthew, like we're going to know in about 100 years, probably less, the impact of all of this on lifespan, on disease, because all of this is so new that we're starting to get the inklings, and we already know that it's bad, but we're really going to get the gravity of the situation over the next generation or two. And what I predict is that we're going to go the other way, and we're going to realize that, wow, 80 to 90% of these diseases can be prevented just by the way we were living and eating. And so it's going to swing the other way once we realize how bad it is. And I think it's still kind of like this, how smoking was, you know, in the past generation, like people know it's bad, but it's still part of the culture. And I think in our next generation, we're going to be like, okay, we know that we have to stop doing this, and it's going to go back to something very different from what it is today.
So why do you feel like it's so hard to have self-control?
I think right now, it's really smoking cigarettes is a great example of how culturally, when things are convenient, addictive, cool, become part, like woven into society. And it's just easy. It's like the default to do those things. And it takes a lot of effort to not do it. And so it becomes an issue of almost like our neurons, our neural pathways love comfort. They love when you've done something so long that it no longer requires a lot of effort and your body just knows. So when you grew up and I grew up and we got, say, Doritos and Oreos after school when we were tired and stressed, our neural pathways kind of know that as our comfort pathways. And so that's why it's really hard 20 years later to say, I'm not going to have Oreos or something comforting and junk food after school or after a stressful day, because those neural pathways were already set. So it's going to take a lot of effort to make a new pathway. And so that's hard. And I think people find it, I mean, we see a change, obviously, I think in the last 10 years since I've been in this field, I've seen a huge change. Like people are trying to change those old habits, but it's really hard because these are like built into our neural pathways, right? We want, and I think you can probably remember, and I definitely remember patterns from your childhood or when you're growing up where food or drink was a part of it, like ultra processed food or drink. And so it's very hard to rebuild those pathways. And I think that's really the hard part for people today, is because we already have a pattern that's set. And then now we have to kind of reset it.
Yeah. Well, you talked about pretty, you dedicated a lot of energy into you said food companies are purposely hijacking our brains with foods that they create. And I think a lot of people, like, they have the cravings, and like you mentioned the thing about the neural pathways in the brain, so that's kind of like hardwired now into us, but they don't realize that it's actually like an outside influence, someone sitting in a lab trying to figure out how to create that effect in you.
I know.
And so can you tell me a little bit about that whole thing, what's happening there? Yeah.
So imagine that when you eat a French fry from McDonald's, or let's do a Dorito, okay? When you eat a Dorito, I think most people would say probably it does taste better than a corn chip, like just a corn tortilla that has been fried with salt, right? And the reason it tastes better is because they've done a lot of research to hit certain flavors, textures, centers in your brain that can release the most dopamine so that you go back and have that again because you want that feeling. So I would say that dopamine is the strongest neurochemical in our entire body. And that's why everyone wants a piece of it. It's the chemical that will make you get up from the seat after we're done with this, get up, drive across town, and buy or attain that thing that you were craving. The cravings from dopamine are that strong. And so if you can influence someone to love your food or drink so much that they would actually get up and drive across town to get it, I mean, you won, right? So that's the goal. And there's food science labs all over the country, in every university, in every one of these big companies, where they're trying to study how do you make the mouthfeel. How do we get all the taste buds? How do we create the biggest explosion of dopamine so that they will keep coming back? And it's not just food companies. You know, and I know that when you reach for your phone and you go to TikTok or Instagram or any of these apps, they also are studying your dopamine.
They're working on the same pathway.
Yeah, it's the same pathway. They're all trying to get a piece of that cravings pathway because they know that if you crave it, you will use it, buy it, drive across town to obtain it. And so the food companies really have exploited this. And if you can imagine, I tell my kids this, you know, if you have a processed fast food meal, it's literally giving you that dopamine hit without the benefits of fiber, of protein, of probiotic foods, of polyphenols. And so what was meant to be food ends up being just a kind of fake dopamine hit without the nutrition. And so that's where the problem lies. In nature, when you eat food that creates a dopamine release, it fits because it's like you ate a sweet piece of fruit and you will get a dopamine hit because your body wants to remember where that tree was so that when your group needs food, you remember.
But it's not like a massive dopamine hit.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, because if you have an apple or a cherry, I mean, they taste great, but it's not the same as when you're having an ultra-processed food that's literally engineered to give you the biggest dopamine hit ever. And I think you know, and I know, I've experienced that. I'm sure you have too. Like, for example,
you can't stop eating something.
Yeah, when you can't stop, you're full, or technically full, but you can't stop eating it. Or this is a really good test. Like, if you are not hungry for food, like a meal, a protein, fiber-rich meal, but you would get in your car and go get this treat, that is your dopamine system. It's completely different than hunger.
I've literally done that before.
Yeah, I think everyone has.
Like just like leave the house, but it's just like you're just sitting there. It's like it actually requires like a lot of effort to go like do it, and like, but like the craving is so strong.
I mean, we talked about Columbia. So when I would exit the subway station at Columbia Presbyterian, no, I went to the 168.
Okay,
there was a Starbucks right there. And so I would tell myself when during the holidays, like if I had a really hard day or if something good happened or bad happened, whatever, I would get myself a treat and almost like justified it. But really I was taking a different route so that I could stop by that Starbucks on the way home or on the way to work. And I remember when I was writing this book thinking like, that's what I did. I mean, I wasn't hungry, but the thought of getting that peppermint mocha, you know, during the holidays was so strong that I literally went out of my way, wasted time, energy, money to get something that just gave me kind of a dopamine hit.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we had one of our earliest guests on the show was Dr. NLMP. She works at Stanford. She's an addiction medicine specialist.
So that's what it is.
Yeah. And so she was on The Social Dilemma. I don't know if you saw that that documentary on Netflix.
Oh, yeah. No, I never saw that, but I know what that is.
But no, she was just talking, and she wrote a book called Dopamine Nation, and she was talking about how we're just living such an addicted, she called it addictogenic world, where like all of these brilliant minds and companies have like hacked into this dopamine pathway system and just literally made everything addictive. And so we're literally just all running around like addicts now.
I know.
And the food companies like are just kind of masters at doing this. And so, I mean, you mentioned the thing about research and labs, and then you talked, I think in your book, about this idea of like the bliss points. So can you like take us like inside a lab? Like what is going on in a lab where they're doing things like that?
I was just at a university a few years ago, and I saw one of those labs. So it's like, imagine two long tables, kind of like in a classroom maybe, and seats like this. And then there's like headphone type things. And then there's screens in front of them. And this is a food lab where they're giving people different shapes, size, and flavored foods. And they're kind of recording what's happening. I guess they have to answer questions. There's like a screen there. And then there's like a headpiece that's checking like electrical activity. And so you can imagine that what they're doing is they're bringing people in. They're setting different shapes, sizes, flavors, colors, and they're recording the response. And if you can imagine, it's brilliant, right? It's brilliant because you want to know, did the shape make a difference? Did the mouthfeel make a difference? They want the flavors to get to a bliss point in your evaluation of them, so that you just feel so good when you eat it that you just want more and more. And so they're spending enormous money on getting this data so that they can create things that fit that profile. So if you imagine a soda company or a snack company doing this, that's why nothing, take Doritos as an example since I already just used it, but that's why there's nothing in nature that looks, tastes, smells anything like a Dorito, right? Or an Oreo. You could not recreate it even if you had every ingredient in the world, because they've taken something that has ingredients in it and then they started to add things to it to improve that flavor, to give it a better texture, to melt in your mouth in a certain way. The mouthfeel is a big deal for people because you don't want it to be stuck in your teeth. You don't want it to be, too oily. Like there's a big science in just mouthfeel, flavor, texture, shape. And so these cookies and crackers and cakes and sodas, and they aren't something that you could ever recreate in your own kitchen. And that's literally the definition of an ultra-processed food. So an ultra-processed food, the way because people always say like, how do I even know if I'm eating one of those? If you have a product that you're eating that could never be recreated in a kitchen, even if you had every ingredient in the world, that means that food has been altered in a way to improve palatability, flavor, texture, shelf life, all that. That is an ultra-processed food. And that's where the trouble starts, because ultra-processed food has been shown in every single study to worsen depression, anxiety, cancer, diabetes, heart disease, and early death. I mean, among other things. So we are eating foods that are proven to take our health in a negative direction. Like even if you don't care about your heart disease and diabetes risk, you do care about feeling depressed. Like I don't want to be eating foods or feeding my family foods that end up making them feel depressed. And that's exactly what happens.
Why does processed food do that?
Because, there's a lot of different, we don't have exactly the pathway, but there's a gut-brain connection, right? Our gut bacteria communicate with the brain all day long through walkie-talkie. It's like a virtual walkie-talkies. And the gut bacteria are telling the brain what's happening and what inflammation is going on, what kind of inputs we're having. And so what we're understanding now is that when we eat things like ultra-processed foods, our gut bacteria, not only are they not being fed because they only like fiber, polyphenols, protein. They are not only are they starving, they're sending inflammatory signals and walkie-talking to the brain that there's inflammation here and that there's something that's something foreign here. And so we believe that gut-brain connection, that dopamine that's released in the gut, that immune system pathway. There's like 4 different ways that the gut is communicating with the brain at all times. And when you're not giving the gut the right inputs, it is going to send signals to your brain to be tired, to be anxious, and to be depressed. And so we now know that that gut-brain connection is almost like the biggest next foray in medicine, because we're thinking now, okay, wait, if it goes that way, it also goes the other way. It's a 2-way communication. And so could we also help depression, anxiety through changing the gut? And the studies are very positive. Yes, if you modulate the gut in a positive way, you can cure all kinds of diseases, including anxiety, ADHD, depression. And so there's a lot of potential for modulating our diets and inputs to either increase or decrease depression, anxiety. The people that eat the most ultra-processed foods have the most depressed and anxious days. And it's like so tightly correlated, and even in children and adolescents. And so I think that part, to me, if you don't even care about the cancer, the diabetes, the heart disease, like that to me was...
I think if you get cancer, you're going to care. But.
Yeah, I mean, like down the line.
Yeah,
so
like for
20
somebody,
years down the line.
Yeah.
Like if you told a teenager like, oh, don't do this because you could, you know, get heart disease one day. They're like, I don't care, you know. But if you tell them like, hey, it's actually influencing your mood, your motivation, your drive, and your energy levels, like that's a little bit different. You know?
I think part of it, because you also spoke about the marketing aspect, and so like I think a lot of people, they could be listening and be like, oh well, like they're working in a lab to make products that we love, and so that they're just working hard to make them good for us, and that we'll love them, but like they don't actually realize that all these products are causing disease. And it's not, and part of the reason why that's not really hitting is probably because of the marketing end.
Yes.
And so you have celebrities and other people that partner with Pepsi and Coca-Cola, and then you have Super Bowl ads and just make it look really cool. And it looks like something that's fun. It has a fun brand, it has fun colors, it has all this stuff. It
literally looks like you're not fun if you're not having these products, right?
Have you seen I don't know if you've come across cigarette ads from the 1950s.
I've seen some of the old ones. Yeah, it's the same concept, right?
Yeah, they're the cigarette ads in the 1950s. They would say the most outrageous things, like on the covers, like that was so cool to like smoke, and it's kind of like the exact same playbook as the foods companies are using now. And so, yeah, I think it's just like that reality. I think there's a growing awareness of what's happening with food companies, but
yeah, I have to tell you. Okay, so when I was in college, I was in the nutrition school, and my parents moved to Boston, and there was a nutrition conference in Boston that summer. And I was like, oh my God, great. You know, I was like a young student. I wanted to learn. And you go to this nutrition, I totally remember this. I go there not knowing anyone or anything. I just literally just signed up and went. And every single session, every single booth was sponsored. It was like sponsored by all the big food companies. And I thought to myself, and this was before I knew anything about this world.
This was a nutrition conference.
Yes. And this is before I thought, wow, I can't believe that this conference is completely sponsored by these food companies. And of course I understood it, you know, that's where the money is. Like they are paying money so that we can be at this conference. Like the whole way it was framed, and it's always been framed in medicine also with the drug companies, is that like, oh, they're so generous. They're giving you all this money so that you can have this amazing conference and this amazing meal and this amazing like entertainment or whatever. And that's how it's framed for us in medical school. Like when all the drug companies would sponsor things, you would just be like, oh, that's so nice. They're taking us on a, you know, trip or whatever. So yeah, it was literally cereal companies. It was snack bar companies. It was all the big names of every single big food brand you can think of because they had the budget to sponsor things, right? So I remember thinking like, that's so odd. And just the other day, I saw that the Dermatology Society one dermatology society has decided to create a conference, a dermatology conference that is not industry sponsored at all. And I thought that was such a cool idea. Like nutrition should do that. They should do a conference that's not sponsored by food companies at all. When I started my medical residency, our hospital, the Harvard hospitals, the Beth Israel Deaconess Hospital, decided not to take any funding from drug companies for the students and for the residents. So there was no sponsored lunches, there was no sponsored talks, there was no sponsored baseball games, there was no sponsored, and that was the first year that they had decided to block industry from influencing the young doctors. And I think that's what they need to do. Like in the nutrition world, it's still infiltrated by the big companies. And not to say the big companies are blind to this. I think they're starting to realize. You'll see most of the big food companies have started to acquire healthy brands.
That just happened to Siete Foods.
Yes.
With, who acquired them again? Was it Pepsi?
I think it was Pepsi.
Yeah,
and there was so much backlash. But what the food companies are trying to do is they're not trying. I actually think it's a good thing, because what I believe is happening is that there are people in these food companies, and this has happened in pharma too, and that's why I know this, that are aware of the consumer needs and wants and desires, but they're just not in the position to create foods like that yet. And so what they need is these young and nimble brands that have already figured out how to make, you know, tortillas without flour, how to do things without refined sugar, and they are acquiring these brands to actually pivot their big brand to where the consumer is going. So what I mean is, on the outside, it looks really bad, but as long as they don't change the process of what the food companies are doing, and I think, you know, it depends on the big brand, but they're actually like, they need to learn. They know, they're smart. They have lots of money, and they know that they need to learn a lot from these smaller, homegrown, nimble brands about how to create foods that are not going to kill you.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about the addiction, the way that they're engineering them to be addictive, and then how that creates food cravings, and then obviously there's the propensity for disease with ultra processed food. But then the other thing you talked about in your book is like the things that are actually being added in and put into the foods. And so can you share a little bit about like that, about what's going in the foods?
Okay, so let's take emulsifiers just as an example, okay? Emulsifiers are the things that make things melt in your mouth smoothly, so it doesn't separate. It's often added to frozen like desserts and ice creams and things like that, just to...
But it's not just food.
Yeah, it's in lots of different products, yeah. But emulsifiers have been shown in many, many studies to actually disrupt the gut barrier. It actually emulsifies our own gut barrier. And so these are things that these companies add things to foods to increase shelf life, to help make it mix better, melt in your mouth better, whatever. But they don't ever check to see what is happening to our body when you eat those things. And it's so interesting because during my first book, I created something called like a little chai latte that I made for myself, and I started to give it to my audience. And the complaints were all about that. Hey, it doesn't mix super easy with hot water. You have to like really mix it. And, you know, there's no emulsifier in there. You know, it separates, or whatever all the complaints were. And I thought to myself, wow, it's like we've gotten so used to things being super shelf stable, super easy to mix, hyper palatable. We forget what real food is supposed to look like or taste like. Things are not supposed to last on the shelf.
Ultra processed food isn't real food.
Yeah, it's food-like substance. And so they're adding things to it to improve the shelf life, to improve the mixing of it, to improve the flavor, the feel, and the texture. That's not really food-based. They're all chemicals that they're adding. And, you know, some chemicals are great. They extend the shelf life, you know, but many of them are causing all kinds of problems in our body that they're really kind of turning a blind eye to.
Yeah, I mean, the emulsifier thing, when I was reading that part of your book, the thing that you said about, it's like laundry, so what's going in laundry detergent is we're eating that.
Yeah. It is literally, emulsifiers are tough because I don't know if you've checked almost every frozen, so many products. I just think of frozen because that's what I've seen recently. It's really hard now to find products like, you think ice cream, shouldn't it just be like cream, sugar, and whatever, chocolate or something, or vanilla beans? No, it's like got all these stabilizers, emulsifiers, like things in it to make it shelf stable, things in it to make it easy. And so that's why, when you look at the data, anything you make at home, even if you don't know how to cook and you're just like assembling things, is going to be healthier for you than the modern food environment. So even if you made pasta at home or a burrito at home, you're using real ingredients to make that. But when you're going to these fast food places, they're actually putting things in the bread, in the beans, in the cheese, in the that aren't even real food. They're just chemicals to make it stable, and you're ingesting all that when you eat that. And so I think for me that made it so clear, like, oh yeah, I don't really need to buy burritos, pasta, or like any of those like simple things that you can put together in your house. Like, yes, it's convenient to go to these stores or fast food places, but when you understand what kind of ingredients that they're putting in there to not even just enhance the flavor, but to enhance the shelf life and the mixability and how well it mixes with the other foods, like, or bulking agents to make it look bigger in the bag. I mean, it's insane what they do to food.
Yeah, and I think that, like, particularly the culpability, it's like there are a lot of emerging smaller food companies that have organic products with good ingredients, like really not that many ingredients, and they find ways to make these products. Yeah. And they don't have those ingredients in them, and to extent. And so you wrote, like, if you don't know what to look for, there's a good chance you won't notice what's being added to your foods. And so I think that's a big problem, is like they're like, okay, there's a growing awareness around like ultra processed foods and all this stuff, but then people don't even know what to look for.
I know, it's like overwhelming.
They just pick up a package, and there's probably crap in there. And
it's really overwhelming, and there's really no good. I mean, I think it's so crazy that other countries, like Mexico, for example, they put a food grade in the front of the food. So for someone who has no idea, they can easily see if it's an ultra processed food and that it's like graded. I think it's like A, B, or C or something like that. And that is something that's common in other countries. And I think it needs to be common here, because how else are people going to be able to decipher what is healthy for them and what's not? I mean, some things are obvious, right? But a lot of things are not obvious, and we need someone to kind of make a grade scale and put it in the front of the package, so that we can, when we pick it up, it's very clear that, hey, at least if it's a grade C or D or whatever it is, at least when you're buying it or consuming it, that's, and you just have less of those, and you have more of the good ones. And so I think that's something that should be commonplace. And of course, food companies don't want that. Of course, they don't want that, because think about like 65% of the grocery store. Actually, it's 75% now. 75% of the grocery store is going to be C's. That's going to be really bad.
Yeah, because 75% of the grocery store is terrible for you. Like, you just walk in there, and it's like right in your face. And then you also was writing about the grocery stores and, like, I guess slotting fees almost. Like, so how how like it's not only like the companies are, they're creating the foods, they're making them addictive, and then they're terrible for you, but then and then they're marketing them to you, but then they're working with the grocery stores. How do you put these things like right in front of you? And so it's like when getting back to the food craving thing, it's like, how would you not fall into a pattern of having food cravings when like something's addictive, and now it's literally as soon as you walk in the store, it's like
in your face.
Even when you're on the checkout line.
Yeah.
I didn't realize this when I was younger. I just thought it was the way it was. And then I'm like looking on the checkout line like recently, I'm like, these are like the worst products in the world for you. And it's intentionally put there. So when you're waiting to check out, maybe I'm going to throw this one in here. I'm going to throw this one in here. And so it's insane.
Well, and I'll give you another perspective. So as I've learned more and more about this, do you know how hard it is to get that shelf space? You have to pay thousands of dollars of your own money. So imagine you're an indie, company that's just trying to make real ingredients. You're using more expensive ingredients. Your products don't last as long. You're not shipping them super far. You're trying to do local sourcing, right? So you have all these costs, and then you have to compete with these mega brands that are placed in these special areas of the grocery store. And if you want to compete with that, you will have to pay upwards of $20,000 to even be placed in that area. And so you can imagine what an uphill battle it is.
For smaller, healthier brands.
Yeah. Can you imagine how could a new brand even compete for that space? And so how would you get someone's attention if you're not in those prime areas that cost extra to be at, right? Like the whole thing. And then there's this other layer. So Target, Walmart, Costco, all of the big grocery chains, they have brokers. So you can't just go up to, I don't know if most people probably don't know this, but I just found this out recently.
Yeah, they probably don't, yeah.
You can't just go up to a grocery store and talk to the owner and say like, hey, I made like a really healthy version of, this chocolate, and I want to sell it in your grocery store. They're not going to talk to you. In fact, the owner of the grocery store probably doesn't even exist because it's a chain that is based in Florida, and there's only like one store near you. And so if you want to get into these stores, you have to pay thousands of dollars to be introduced to a broker, kind of like your salesperson, who gets paid to take your product to Target or Walmart. And each chain has a different broker, so you can't use the same broker for everything. A grocery store broker, a Walmart broker, Costco broker. And they go to the brand and they compete with all the other brands that are trying to get into the store. So imagine your little indie chocolate is now competing with all the big boys and their versions of that. And they have relationships, and they've, worked with them for years, and they have the big name brokers, like almost like the lawyers, the famous ones. And so you're not only spending more money on production, you're also competing with them at every level of the game. And so in America, if you want a new food in the grocery store, it is going to cost you hundreds of thousands of dollars of investment. And so that's why it's so hard. And that's why you can't just, think of a new product that would be healthy and kind of put it into stores. Like, it doesn't work like that here.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny you say that. I mean, so you're describing obviously the bigger stores, and then even when it comes down to the convenience stores, I probably a month ago I walked downstairs in New York City and the convenience store, and I just asked the guy who like either owns a place or whatever. I'm like, how did these products like get here?
Yeah.
And so, like, even with the small guys, they have reps like going in these
these
stores.
are these brokers that take money from the brands. And like I said, if you have a lot of money, you get the good good guys that have lots of relationships for many years. And so it's this whole game of trying to not only get into the stores, but when you get into the stores and you have to pay premium to be featured. And then it is a very, very difficult game for a small brand. They're basically deterring small brands from even trying, because who do you know that's an entrepreneur that just happens to have $1 million of cash to like get their idea started?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, this goes back to, so many people have shame about their eating habits. And I think that when you understand the big picture, it's like, it truly isn't your fault. And I think,
yes,
I truly believe, I think food companies have blood on their hands in the sense that like if you were to create a strategic plan of like, how do we create mass disease in America or a country and early death and all these things and get people addicted, they're like executing this to perfection on every single level. We've talked about like 6 different layers like going on here, and it's just, I don't know, it's just evil. It's just evil what's going on, because like, if that's like your life mission is like, I'm going to make so much money creating these products and it's doing this to the general population, it's like, what are we doing? I
know, but it's like the cigarette, thing. And it's like the drug companies, because I know so much about drug companies because in medicine, we're so like intertwined with pharma. And it's the same story often with the pharmaceutical companies. Like they think of themselves kind of like as a savior, like we're doing something that's really great. Yes, it has, these negative things too, but it's almost like that's what I feel like the food companies do. Like we're creating fun, we're creating, freedom of choice, but it's like at what cost? Like why do we need 100 different ingredients in our chips, like, or our regular food that we're eating? So I think you're right, though. I think very, very soon, and it's happening right now, I think these big companies are going to be forced to make a change. And whether it's labeling, whether it's reformulating things, whether it's educating the public, I think educating the public, to me, feels the most empowering, because I feel like if you can go into the grocery store and actually know some of the things that you should be buying, like that's the most empowering, right? To be like, I don't actually want any of that stuff. And even if you do, like, I'm not demonizing if you want some of those like C and D products that I was telling you about, just make sure you limit them and get a few of those. There's nothing wrong with having it once in a while, right? But it is, as long as you know that you're having that and it's that bad for you. It's like, remember when they had calories on all the menus? Do they still have that in New York?
Yeah, I think
that got phased out in most other places, by the way.
Yeah.
Because I think people didn't love knowing. And it's like, wow.
There was a real impact of the cigarette ads and the late 90s, early 2000s. Like I feel like if you were looking at a chart, there's other factors that influenced why people stopped smoking at the rate that they were, but like it just kind of peaked around the time when like a lot of the awareness was going on. And I agree with you. I think that like, someone like yourself or like people that have platforms or whatever that are doing education, I think could go a long way to creating change. When
I talk to people, this is the hardest part. So I try to stay on the positive. So I always say to people, like lately I've been talking about this 30-33, which is like 30 grams of protein in the morning, 30 grams of fiber throughout the day, and 3 probiotic foods. And it is so different from the standard American diet that I literally have started talking about it so much more now, because I realize, people don't even know how would this even happen? How could I even get 30 grams of fiber in a day? Because if you're trying to have the minimum 25 grams of fiber, and I say 30 is your goal, you would be part of less than 5% of the population in the whole modern world.
Yeah.
Isn't that nuts?
That is nuts. Yeah.
That you would be there's less than 5% of people who are getting that much fiber. And to get that much fiber, you basically have to like stop eating these store-bought, hyper palatable, ultra processed foods to make room for the fiber. And the fact, if you say 30 grams of protein in your first meal, that pretty much takes out all of the bagels, croissants, cookies, and it forces you to kind of have something like a yogurt or eggs or tofu or black beans to get that 30 grams. It's really hard otherwise. And then the 3 probiotic foods, it's like we're eating 0 probiotic foods in our diet. To even get 1 a week is a big deal to people. And so what I've noticed is when people are trying to do this, they automatically cannot eat the same ultra processed foods or fast foods that they used to. And I think it's really magical because then you can kind of break your addiction from that stuff. And once you know, and I know, once you step away from it just for a little bit, you can look at it from afar and actually assess what was happening. And I think until you do that, and when you're like intertwined in it, it's really hard to know what it's doing to you.
Yeah.
And you have to kind of have a break from it to really see like, wow, I was addicted to that.
Yeah. I mean, the big thing that we didn't talk about that is in everybody's foods, like disproportionately is sugar.
Yes.
And you actually wrote that sugar can affect the brain much like cocaine does.
Yeah. So sugar is the fastest way for us to get a dopamine spike, right? And drugs, and alcohol, and it's akin to that when they looked at it in lab studies. Now, in real life, we know obviously that something like cocaine and is extremely addictive, and you wouldn't say necessarily that sugar in real life acts exactly like cocaine, but in labs it does. And if you look at the mechanism, it's the same. And if you look at the population of people who are having a lot of sugar, you can notice that their requirements for sugar go up over time. And so what used to be enough sugar is no longer, just like the way cocaine or any of the drugs act, right? Like your receptors start to want more for the same
like the
effect.
Way porn works too. Like the same type of.
It's the same thing. You get desensitized.
Yeah.
And your body needs more to get the same effect. So if you've ever noticed, the holiday drinks over time have more and more and more and more sugar because the consumer is now already used to and is not getting that same dopamine hit from the amount of sugar that they had before, exactly like drugs and porn, alcohol. And so really, you can put it all in the same continuum, right? Because you're basically putting something in your body that can potentially kill you, that is very addictive, that has a desensitization process where you require more and more amounts. And people think it's like crazy to think of all of that in the same realm, but it really is. It's all part of the same continuum. It's that dopamine pathway, and you're trying to hijack that dopamine pathway as much as possible. And like you said, we at this point are literally going from dopamine hit to dopamine hit, from our phones to the internet porn to the sugar in our foods to the drugs available to us at the time. And I think it's really interesting when you think about it. And I'm not saying, I think it's important also to realize that dopamine has always been a part of our lives. It's intrinsic, and if you look thousands of...
Dopamine's not bad.
It's not bad.
It's a natural thing.
Exactly. And if you look thousands of years ago, they used to do things. There were drugs, there's natural compounds that they used to use to enhance dopamine release, right? It was just in a different form, and not in every facet of their life, and not in their food.
And not huge spikes.
Yeah. Like when we went to Peru, they gave us coca leaves, right? That's cocaine, really, if you, but they're in leaf form. Yeah. So you have to chew it or eat it or drink it in a tea. So it's not ultra refined, though, to the point where it's a white powder. Sugar is the same thing. You have it in apple, berries, even like a sweet fruit. But when you end up refining it and taking out just that dopamine hit and making it into powder, I mean, it's like a kin, right?
What does sugar do to the body? Like that's like negative.
So sugar is not negative in general, like meaning that your body, and we started this conversation by our primary source of fuel is glucose, which is a sugar. We need glucose for our function. You could argue that you could just function on fats and proteins, but you really do need some glucose in your body. So sugar is inherently something that we want, that makes our body function very easily. Our metabolism is created to process sugar. The problem is that if you take, it's like, I heard this analogy and I thought it was so good. If you love tequila, and I don't know if you love tequila, but if you love tequila and you have it for breakfast and then for a snack and then for lunch and then for dinner and then 3 times before you go to bed, that is going to have a big effect on your body and your brain. But if you love tequila and you had it every 3rd day in a very, very small amount, that could be really great for you and could be a part of your life in a very positive way. And that's the same thing with sugar. Like sugar inherently is not terrible for you. What it is when you refine it to the point where it's completely devoid of any fiber or any polyphenols or any other ingredients that could be giving us signals to our gut. And then you're having it breakfast, for snack, for lunch, for dinner, and then 3 times before bed. That's where it becomes a problem. Because, in the beginning, when you're having it once or twice or 3 times a day, your body is able to process that. And then when you start to have it 4 times a day, it has a little bit of trouble, and now you're having it all day long, and that's
But if you were to have like, if I'm eating meat 5 times a day, like that is generally, so what would be different about sugar that eating it 5 times a day would?
I think even if you said eating oil 5 times a day is also not good for you, right? Like it's actually, so sugar is not inherently bad, but what happens is, when you have it in a refined form, not only does it trigger your dopamine pathways, which we've talked a lot about, but our body has trouble storing all of that sugar. So it needs to get that sugar into your cells. And once you've kind of gotten all of the sugar into your cells and you still have more, it goes to your liver to store sugar for later. But then once it's done with the liver, it has nowhere to go. And now it's like floating around in your bloodstream with nowhere to go because all the cells are bulging. They're closed their doors. That's insulin resistance. They're like, we cannot let any more sugar in. Our cells are bursting. And you are frantically trying to make more, fat cells, and your liver's already full. Where is it supposed to go? And so that's when it becomes a problem. That's when insulin resistance happens. That's when diabetes happens, is because it has you have too much for your own cells to handle. Your cells can only take in so much and store so much for later. Like you didn't stop eating when your cells were full and then your liver's full. And so we get all kinds of problems from the fact that we're just having too much sugar. So like liver disease, for example, fatty liver, for example, diabetes, insulin resistance, all, dementias like a type 3 diabetes, all of these problems, heart disease, because when you have sugar flowing around in your blood, you are adding to the plaques all over your body, right? So that's really the problem, is if you stopped, or there's two options. If you stopped before it got super full, or you went for a long exercise or a long run or a long fast where either you're not eating sugar for a long time or you're using up the sugar, then you're fine. And you can process it. And so if you take someone who's insulin resistant because their cells are so full and they're eating so much sugar, and you put them on an exercise plan where now they're moving for an hour a day and using up a lot of that excess sugar, all of a sudden their insulin resistance goes away.
Is there, we had Robert Lustig on this podcast as well. He was talking about the difference that there's like two different types of, like there's glucose and fructose.
Yes.
And it seemed like he was talking about research around fructose being more harmful than glucose. And it seems like this big controversial thing.
Yes, it is kind of a controversial thing. So I would say that for the normal person, the way I would think about it is like that tequila analogy, is like you either have to limit the amount of sugar that you're having, so you're not having it breakfast, lunch, dinner, and snack, or in between the bouts of sugar, you are using up some of that sugar, whether it be an exercise or an overnight, like a circadian fast. For example, that's why I love circadian fasting, because I think, say you stop eating at 6 p.m. and you don't go to bed till 9 or 10, you have 3 to 4 hours for your body to finally have a chance to let some of that blood sugar into those cells that were so overwhelmed, right? And if you're going for a walk, even better, right? That's why blood sugar control is so much better. So my philosophy is that, yes, you want to limit your sugar, but you also want to limit how many times a day you have it, the amount you have, and how much exercise or fasting you intersperse with that, so that your body can actually process it. And it's like, of course, if you think about liquid sugar, for example, and that's why this becomes such an issue, like high fructose corn syrup is like the classic example. You could have 56 grams of sugar in one drink.
Which is like way more than the daily limit, no?
Yes.
Yeah.
And not even, blank, right? Like there's people who have that all the time, and it doesn't feel like it doesn't make you full, but all of a sudden you have so much sugar coursing through your blood vessels that they have nowhere to go. They don't have a place to put all that sugar. And so I think understanding that our food system right now has created such a sugar surplus that we have no place to put it. And all of these, it's in everything. I remember my parents talking about that when they were growing up, refined sugar, white sugar, was super expensive.
Like table sugar?
Yeah, like in India, getting white sugar was very expensive. It was either a brown, like rock version, it's called like jaggery, that's kind of like unrefined and brown and has like a flavor to it. And that's what they would use in their food. And they're like, it was like you couldn't have it in all the foods you're eating. But now if you go to any of these countries, it's just like America, where there is, 8 to 12 spoons of sugar in every drink, in every, food item. Things that don't even taste sweet to us have that much sugar.
Well, I think that it gets back to what we're talking about with the food companies, right? So it's like, it's just being that's like another thing in the playbook that they're just adding like copious amounts of sugar. And it's insane to think that like, what if you have like one like can of a 12-ounce like Pepsi, you're like already at your sugar like intake for the entire day. And I mean, it's undeniable, like the whole thing we're talking about with it goes back to the addictive thing. I mean, I even felt it with, kombucha is a good, has probiotics, stuff like that. And so I would have one, but then the cycle that you were talking about of like becoming desensitized to one.
Yes.
And then I was having like two. And so then I like weaned myself off of having two. And now I have like maybe a half or one. Sometimes I don't have it. But it's like even with kombucha, and I had like maybe 12 grams of sugar in each bottle. And that was just naturally occurring sugar. I think they had some added sugar in it, but it was just more of naturally occurring sugars. And I even felt that with just 12 grams of sugar. So
I know. And I think, I know we weren't planning to talk about this, but that's why these GLP-1s, semaglutide and similar medications have changed the game. I mean, in the positive light of things, I would say
so these are
Ozempic. This is really bad for the processed food companies.
Ozempic?
Yes, because when you take someone who is completely addicted, okay, there's nothing that breaks the cycle. You wake up, you have your Frappuccino, your milkshake, your processed, ultra-processed fast food meal, then you have your chips and cookies and whatever, right? You put this person on a GLP-1 agonist, which are these medications like Ozempic and Wegovy, and all of a sudden, they don't crave those anymore. It touches the craving center. And they don't feel hungry for those snacks anymore, even though they're engineered for that person. And all of a sudden, that person can see themselves, like we said, can see themselves from afar. And while they're on this medication, are like, wait a second, like I feel so much better and clearer and not addicted. And
because you don't have addict brain in it anymore.
Yeah. And so I don't think people realize that this is happening on a large scale in our modern world, that people who are the biggest consumers of these brands that we've been talking about for years now, but I've seen it with my own eyes, with my own patients. They're like, I don't even go through the drive-thru anymore. I don't feel like getting the same snacks anymore. And it's like, what are these companies are gonna die because all of their customers are no longer interested.
Well, I think, I do think, talking about Ozempic is highly relevant to the idea of food cravings and stuff.
Yes.
A lot of people are doing it for like body image.
Yeah.
Stuff
Some
like
people
that.
are doing it to fit into a dress on Friday. Like that's different than.
So what's your take?
Yeah. So my take is that if you're doing it to fit into a dress on Friday, first of all, it doesn't work that way. It's not that fast acting. If you're doing it because you're highly addicted to ultra processed foods and you just cannot break free and you're 100 pounds overweight and you have diabetes and you have heart disease, or you're on the way to both of those, this can be life-changing. And I don't say life-changing in the fact that like you need to take this forever and whatever, but like I just gave you the example of people coming to me and saying, I don't really crave it anymore. Like I don't need to go to the drive-thru 3 times a day anymore. I don't need that big gulp. I don't want that snack. And to have that freedom, even for a short period of time, I think it's going to do, in those cases, more good than harm. Now, of course, and I know there's celebrities and models and people abusing it and taking it when they're not supposed to, but there's a flip side to it. And for the food aspect that we're talking about, the food addiction aspect, this is like the closest thing to having a cure for food addiction. And to have something like, imagine if when we're talking about smoking, akin to the smoking story, right? Imagine if you had a patch, a nicotine patch that works so well that you don't even want cigarettes anymore. I mean, that's not true, right? Because most
it's actually working that well.
It's working that well for cravings. And it is changing consumer behavior in that these big companies are like trying to figure out ways to market foods in a different way, because their biggest consumer, because those are the biggest consumers, right? The people who are 100 pounds overweight, who are addicted, go visit those places 3 times a day, or buying copious amounts of snacks. And so it's such a big impact that over the next few years, it's going to work in our favor, in a sense that people all of a sudden, not only are they more educated about it, but now they have a way of not wanting that. Can you imagine, like, if we had that for smoking, like a cure that worked that well?
So Ozempic specifically, like that is that why there's a craze around this, or is it really because I found a drug where I could just lose a massive amount of weight and look better? Like, is it? I think
like, both.
You think it's both?
I think it's like, I think Hollywood has made it obvious that some people are using it because they just want an easy way out. They're not looking to, they're not looking for the diabetes, heart disease, and obesity risks. But what I've found is that there's a huge population of people that couldn't get out of the matrix. Do you know what I mean? When you're like stuck in that rut. And I know we've all been there in some sort of way, where we just got addicted or kind of obsessed or into something, and maybe for years. And it's just, you're trying to find a way out. And I think it's really, really a game changer for that population of people. Now, there is a huge population of people that is inappropriately using it, but the population of people that is pre-diabetic or diabetic or obese to the point where they would probably qualify for weight loss surgery, it's actually one of the things I think is going to change eating behavior so much that it's like akin to finding a cure for smoking addiction. Like, imagine if there was a cure for smoking addiction, how fast that would have changed in our society.
So you can't just get it out of just in a store.
No.
So what is the process of actually getting it?
So if you have diabetes, you qualify. If you have obesity, at a certain range, you qualify. And, there are compounding pharmacies that are doing it for people who have like borderline diabetes. But the real studies have been done on people with diabetes and people with obesity. So Wegovy is kind of the obesity only version of it, whereas Ozempic and similar ones are for the diabetes version of it. And the problem is, there's a couple problems with it. Like, number one, it's a lifelong therapy. So it's like taking a blood pressure pill. Like, if you stop taking the blood pressure pill, your blood pressure is going to go back up, right?
You mean the food cravings are going to come back?
Yes. So that's a problem, right? Unless you are going to modify your life in such a way, you're going to have to keep taking it indefinitely. So that's a huge problem. A second huge problem is for obese patients, the weight seems to come right back when you stop using it. So it is clearly not the panacea for all of this. But it's giving people a window into what it would look like if they were out of that matrix. And so that's
what about like the side effects and like downsides and stuff like that?
So the downsides are that it slows down gastric emptying. So your digestion gets slowed. So a lot of people can feel nauseous or constipation, etc. There's a slight risk of pancreatitis because of that slowing. And so those are definitely risks associated with it. I would say cost is the big downside. It's like you're paying to not eat in excess. You know what I mean? Like it's kind of backwards if you think about it as like expensive medicine to stop you from. But I think in our world today, if you look at those people who are really just struggling so much and they want to do the right things, but they just can't break out of that dopamine addiction cycle, I think it's interesting. I think it's like, hey, look, this is what your life would be like if you didn't depend on all these foods and drinks.
So who definitely should not be like taking it?
You should not take it if you aren't struggling with obesity and diabetes. Yes, there are soft indications like you're pre-diabetic, or you could argue that, you know, you have some kind of condition that makes you, but unless you have those real indications, it's not necessarily the right thing for you. Because if you're someone, GLP is a normal, is in our body. It's glucagon-like peptide 1. It's normally released. So you and I have GLP-1 in our body. There are foods that stimulate GLP-1 release. And so it is a naturally occurring thing in our bodies. And so we shouldn't, we shouldn't really need to have an agonist for it. So an agonist means it pumps out more GLP-1. And so we shouldn't need that because our own bodies can get feedback, you know, the gut-brain feedback. This is a gut-based bioactive. So our gut should be able to release enough GLP-1 that we feel satisfied with food. But you know, and I know that in our modern American diet, there are many people who are not releasing enough GLP-1 or are not eating the foods to release it, or their body is kind of like deaf to the GLP-1. And so that's what it does for those people.
It's kind of interesting. I mean, think about pharma companies up against food companies.
Exactly. I love it. I think it's like head to head. And the food companies are freaking out. You don't understand. There's a lot of drama because their biggest consumers, their biggest customers. Imagine the cigarette companies. If their biggest chain smokers found something that stopped them completely from buying cigarettes. Imagine the drama and the panic. And so there's a lot, they're really going head to head right now. And so you could say, yes, why do we need a medication to do what our bodies are naturally made to do? Like, of course, that's the downside of this. Like, shouldn't we be able to regulate our own appetite, our own craving cycles? But I think we made a big case for why it's not necessarily their fault.
Yeah.
And often it's passed down through habits and even genetic changes from parent to child. And so imagine you're a child or teenager now in 20s and you can't break out of this matrix. That's who it's for.
Yeah, no, I mean, you wrote a whole book about it. I think that people obviously are interested in escaping the cycle of food cravings.
Yeah.
And, you know, everybody kind of wants a one and done type thing with the pill. But like, what I loved about your book is that you laid out a plan and strategies that would help people. And then you don't have to deal with like the side effects or also being on a medication for your entire life.
Yeah, exactly.
And so, I mean,
that's the whole goal, right? Is to get people to the point where you can make these decisions for yourself about what to eat, how to live, how to exercise, how to sleep without being swayed by an addiction or a drink or product. It's like, how do you live life without being an alcoholic? You know what I mean? Like it's akin to that. Like, how do you live life awake and alert and making the right choices to eat without being addicted to all of these foods? That's the goal.
What would you say about, you know, obviously be easier. Like we laid out a big case of like what is actually going on. It's not your fault, clearly. obviously it would be easier if like these conditions and temptations didn't constantly exist all day long. And so what is your perspective on like willpower and like self-control?
My perspective on willpower is that you cannot willpower your way through anything in life. Willpower and white knuckling is never going to work in any aspect of your life. And I think we can easily see that with cravings. I mean, that's an obvious thing. So I think unless you put habits in place, you change your gut bacteria, that communication between your gut bacteria and your brain, you will not be able to just white knuckle your way out of cravings or white knuckle your way out of, doing something that you hate. You know what I mean? Like willpower only can get you so far. You actually have to change your habits. And once you do, that gut bacteria and that communication will help you. So the more you feed your gut bacteria healthy foods with fiber, with protein, probiotic foods, polyphenols, for example, the more it will send signals to your brain to want more of those. And so it will work in your favor. Once you change that gut bacteria, it takes about 3 days to start changing. That gut bacteria will help you. And so the more you do your habits, the more you start to change your internal environment and the easier it gets.
Yeah, you also talked about like removing food cues. It reminded me of what Anna Lempke said about it. She called it like self-binding, almost, of like putting a physical distance between you and whatever it is you're addicted to. And so that, in this case, obviously food, just like not stocking your kitchen with certain things and not having it around. And so what would you say about, like, as you're introducing what you're talking about, like the negative, like the stuff that you're trying to avoid, like how do you relate to that?
Yeah. So it's like, it's a very common recommendation to alcoholics, right? Do not take the route home where you pass the liquor store that you always used to go to. Take a different way home. And that's exactly how I would say it. Like if you equate sitting in front of your TV with the bag of snacks that are sitting right there next to you, and it's like what you're programmed to do, just change it up. Take that bag of snacks away from there, or change your habit. You're not watching TV at that same time in the same place, change your environment. Get rid of the pantry snacks that are so easy. So like, a lot of us, and me included, I would come home from work and I would like almost like a zombie, like walk straight into the kitchen and like open that pantry. Right. And so I had to do that to myself, is like change the route. Like now I don't go straight into my kitchen. I go to the bathroom and I wash up and I change. So physically distancing yourself or changing the route and your habit pattern, that can really kind of wake you up so that you're not kind of working in like a zombie pattern. Yeah,
that's really good. One big thing that you talked about alongside the way that our food engineered is you can't understate the impact. I mean, even personally, like the idea of emotional eating. And so if your stress levels are high, and we've already talked about how these foods like are a comfort, what would you say about like emotional eating? And so like, let's just say you came home and you're like, had a very like stressful day, and then it's just like the first thing you want to do.
I have something called the bowl trick in my in the book. So one of the things I do and I've taught people to do is like, okay, so say you've restocked your kitchen with healthier versions of those foods, like, we already talked about like ultra processed versus not ultra processed. Say you've done that, but you just came home and you need a snack or a drink. Okay, so you're gonna go to your kitchen. After you wash up, like I said, change your habits, the order of things you do to just make yourself more aware. And you go and you get a small bowl and you fill it up with all the snacks that you want. Yeah. And then you take that bowl. You don't stand in the kitchen. You don't stand with an open container, because those foods, as we talked about, they're meant to make you just unsatisfied enough that you want more, So you're going to take, say, your nuts and your popcorn. Maybe you're trying to do unrefined, ultra processed foods. And so you get your bowl of snacks and then you go outside or as far from the kitchen as possible. And for me, often it's outside because nature, sunlight, is calming. So nature sounds, even leaves in the wind, being in nature in general is very cortisol calming. It lowers cortisol, and being in nature, having sunlight also is something that can curb cravings and appetite, because sunlight also.
Wait, so are you literally holding it while you're in the sunlight?
Yeah, you're like sitting on a little booth,
so you're
or
not
whatever.
Eating it.
So you're bringing it out to there, and then you're going to eat it there. I'm saying, like, bring it to a little area, cove, a little area in your backyard. If it's outdoors, that's ideal. And then you're going to eat your snack as far away from the kitchen as possible. And you're going to get your stress relief because you're outside, you're in nature, you're getting your sunlight. And that's like my biggest trick is like, you're not depriving yourself and saying like, I'm going to white knuckle my way through this. I'm not going to have it. Because you know how that goes. You do it for day 1, day 2, day 3, and then day 4, you're like back in the same cycle. So you're doing with food, especially, and especially if you choose more less processed versions of those foods, and then you take it as far away from the kitchen and as far away from your routine as possible, you can really help with those kind of cravings, especially on a stressful day after work.
Yeah, because it's like a double whammy. Isn't like the worst time to eat when you're feeling like highly stressed and like emotional?
Yes.
Like on your body?
Yes. And so
why is it important to get into a relaxing state?
And also like, so cortisol, as you know, is our primary stress hormone. And when you have high cortisol, what happens is your digestion slows down because cortisol is priming you to be in an emergency mode. So it's going to like put all the blood flow into your big muscles and make your eyes really focused, and your brain is in like just focusing on the task at hand. So you and I both know when your epinephrine, your cortisol, and your stress hormones are high, you almost can't even think straight. You can only think about the thing that's stressing you out. And your digestion does the same thing. It's slowed. It's like, we need to concentrate on this emergency. And so you really don't want to be eating food or digesting at that time. You need to take your body, which unfortunately our bodies, our minds are often in that state a lot of the day. Yeah. We're getting alerts and emails and emergency texts, right? So getting ourselves a little bit more relaxed and doing whatever it is, for some people is journaling, prayer, definitely nature, easiest thing, breathing, easiest thing, slowing down your exhale, and then eating has countless benefits to your body.
That's really good. And then you also, you spoke about the idea of intermittent reward scheduling as a way to break food addiction. So what is that and how do we do it?
All right. So the best way for you to be addicted to something or want something is to reward you intermittently. So Vegas, you play, you win, but then you play, don't win. And then you win, right? Like it's like that intermittent reward. And that's the strongest form of dopamine addiction. So you can use that to your favor is what I'm saying, is really try to give yourself or time. There's been tricks to do it, like putting it a jar where, there's some motivational sayings, and then once in a while you'll get a treat, a healthy treat, if that's what you're trying to rewire your brain to do. So just like it can be used in a negative way, it can be used in a positive way. And so intermittent reward, I'll give you the examples like the really bad relationship, right? So that guy or that gal won't text you, won't reply, and then all of a sudden replies super warm and like everything's amazing, you're amazing, and all of a sudden you're like obsessed with that person, right? Like that intermittent reward schedule is very well known in all parts of life, and you can use it to your advantage with food.
That's really interesting. Yeah, so I would imagine that like as you're going through this process, shame is like one of the biggest things that like you have to deal with in terms of it's probably not beneficial if you're like shaming yourself and your negative self-talk as you're going through this process with like kind of reforming your eating behavior, developing healthier eating habits. So like how do you deal with that self-criticism and shame?
Yeah, that's a hard one, right? Because we hold a lot of shame about food, about the way we look, about our relationships, about what we didn't accomplish, like what, there's, I think food shame is so rampant in our country because of this food addiction and the highly palatable foods. And it's almost embarrassing. A lot of people eat by themselves because they have a lot of shame. So I do think there is different levels of it. Obviously, some people need actual medical intervention, therapy to get out of that food shame. I think it's an area that is underdiagnosed and undertreated because I think shame is something that can really ruin your life in so many ways, and holding shame about food or anything else in your life is something that you need to address, and a lot of us don't.
Yeah. What do you think the biggest reason that you've seen that people get stuck and they aren't able to develop a better relationship with food?
I think it's honestly, when it comes to food, at least for women especially, it's so tied into self-worth and image. Because for women, I think weight and the way you look has so much to do with your self-esteem and self-worth, at least traditionally. And food really plays a role. In fact, I think the stats like 90% of women have dieted at some point that's how closely connected food is with image and self-worth for women. And so I think it becomes really difficult because it all becomes like, I hate myself, I hate my body, and I hate this food. It's like all of them. And to break through that, that is really difficult. There's entire books and communities and people all over the internet talking about how they had to break through from hating their bodies for their entire life, thinking that they weren't worthy their entire life, and being, having a negative relationship with food their entire life. Someone as famous as Oprah talks about it all the time, very openly, right? And she's just representative of, like I would say, upwards of 90% of women have some kind of food shame or negative relationship with food, either now or at some point in their life. It's insane to think about that, but it's true. I have a daughter, right? I've mentioned, who's 14, and I'm constantly trying to rebrand what the messages are from society. Like, you should be skinny. You should, not be eating all the time, or you should. There's all these like messages that girls get very early, and I'm always trying to police that as much as I can. But it's a lot of it is around food, and it's almost like you don't want to look like you eat healthy when you're a teen. There's a negative correlation with someone who's super healthy who doesn't say yes to the fries or the soda, but then you also have to be really thin. And so it's a big conundrum for them.
You said 90% of women. Is this something that like you've struggled with feelings around?
Yeah, of course. I remember this, and I talked to my team, and they all laughed because we have different versions of it. So one of my team members said, so right after the holidays, when you came back to college to the new year, it was like get ready for spring break. You know, like it was like every girl knew that they were on a strict diet from January to whatever, March or April or whatever it was for spring break. And I remember so many times. So I went to visit my cousin who lived in Arizona at the time, and her and her friends were getting together. And I went there and they were having cabbage soup. And I was like, what are you guys doing? And they're like, they made a huge pot of cabbage soup and they were going to only have that the entire day. And it was up for like couple days because there was like a big event coming up. And I remember thinking to myself like, oh, that's genius. Like I should do that. That's so great. You eat just cabbage soup for multiple days so that you can, it was so embedded in culture that it wasn't even weird. Do you know what I mean? Like it was just normal part of life. Everyone wanted to be thin and was dieting at all times. And that wasn't even considered weird.
So yeah, to kind of close, I just wanted to like give an opportunity like to speak to those people who are struggling with like their eating habits right now. And so like what advice would you have for people that feel like powerless right now?
That's a really good question. It's not your fault. Your body has a lot of gifts, and a lot of these companies and these foods try to hijack your body, right? But you have the gifts inside of you to kind of reclaim that. And when you change your inputs, you can change your output. So I always talk about inputs as like not just the food. So one big component is food. It's also thoughts. It's also the people you surround yourself with. It's also the habits. Those are the inputs. And when you put the right inputs into your gut, into your body, you get the right outputs out. And if you think about it in that way, it's very easy to change. If you want something different for your output, you have to change your input.
That's really good. And then what about somebody like literally today who's like feels just, I don't know, shame about the fact that they just grabbed that potato chip? What would you say to them?
I don't think there's any shame. I think I've had to work through this too because, coming out of diet culture, I think we all have shame for eating a bag, a bowl of potato chips or a bag of potato chips or full pizza or whatever. And I think if you get rid of the shame and know that your body is so capable of taking that food and using it where it needs to go, and then you just will compensate. Your body knows how to compensate for it the next day. Like your body's amazing, and to trust your body and to not hate yourself or hate the food is, I think, the biggest shift that you can make.
It's really good. Well, Amy, thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate it and enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate you.